Good afternoon. My name is Joe Hewitt. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. I am the Vice President for Policy, Learning, and Strategy, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you today. We have a fantastic program that closes out a very busy month that we have had looking at issues related to gender and conflict on this, the National Women's National History Month. Let me just say a little bit about USIP for those who are new to this place. USIP was founded in 1984 by Congress as an independent national institute dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We pursue this vision of the world without violent conflict by working on the ground with partners. We provide people, organizations, and governments with the tools, knowledge, and training to manage conflict so it doesn't become violent. And when it does become violent, we use these tools to help resolve it. Every day, my team works to collect, organize, and disseminate knowledge and evidence from our programs to inform better peace-building programs in the future. And what's very crucial on our team is that we have a gender policy and strategy team that is led by Kathleen Keenest, who you'll meet in a moment. Every violent conflict, one way or another, is experienced differently by men and women and boys and girls. That means that to fully understand how the consequences of conflict are felt or how the causes of conflict are experienced, we need to be able to understand it through a gendered lens. It's not just, when we talk about gender, we're not just talking about women. And I think one of the really fascinating things about this month that we've just had is that a lot of the exchanges of knowledge that we've had in this building have been had over issues that break down some of that, some of those molds that are not quite right. So we began this month with an event that looked at the role of women not as peace builders, which is often the cliched way of understanding women in conflict, but rather as conflict actors themselves. And today, we finish a very, very good month with what's going to be an amazing program looking at the role of men and masculinity in conflict. And so I'm really looking forward to this panel. I think we're in for something very excellent here. I'm especially interested to know what it means to unpack and understand what it means to be a man in the box. So we're going to find out what that means in a moment. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce to you the director of the Gender Policy and Strategy team, Kathleen Keenest.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Joe. And I also want to add my appreciation to our partners, Promundo and Axe. These are great partners. We've really enjoyed the engagement of bringing this program to you here today. So, stuck in the man box. What does this really mean? In retrospect, when I think of the man box, I go back to a time when I was doing my field work in Soviet Central Asia while the Soviet Union collapsed. And I began witnessing how masculine identity shift was happening. And it was interesting because I was actually there studying what was happening to women. What I came out of that experience realizing that we can't see gender as this kind of biological straitjacket. I really began to appreciate how gender is coded into everything we do and every institution we belong to, and that during times of heightened change, these gender identities and relationships also change, and sometimes change drastically. So this afternoon, we have an opportunity to look firsthand at the results of a brand new study about the man box, which really investigates the way in which boys and young men are socialized and the pathways forward in terms of thinking outside the box. And so we're going to have a presentation of the results, and then we're going to be joined by other experts for a panel discussion, and we want to leave a lot of time for discussion with all of you. So I hope you're thinking of good questions, comments, and also to remind you, we are on Twitter. #ManBox, #USIPGender, and to also note that we are being webcast today, and all of this will be up on our website tomorrow. So without further delay, it is my pleasure now to introduce my good colleague, Gary Barker, and his good colleague, Brian Heilman, who will present the key findings from their study called the Man Box. Gary and Brian's detailed bios are with your agenda, but let me just say that Gary Barker is President and CEO of the NGO Promundo. He's also the co-founder of Men Care, a global campaign to promote men's involvement as equitable, nonviolent caregivers, and also the co-founder of Men Engage. Brian Heilman is a fellow at Promundo. He is an independent researcher and evaluator and the lead author of the 2016 State of America's Fathers Report, and the co-author of multiple reports using the International Men and Gender Equality Survey. I'm going to welcome you to the podium, and we look forward to hearing more about this Man Box. Thank you.
The forward, right? These work, right? So we can move around. Cool. I'm going to start off, and then Brian's going to share the results with you. So we start off with the question, why the Man Box, and why here at USIP? We've been talking a lot and a long time, and we will continue talking more about what gender inequality and what rigid norms about masculinities mean for girls and women. And we're not done. We've not achieved the full equality that we need. USIP has done a lot of pioneering work about saying why it matters to have women's full and equal participation at the table when we're doing peace negotiations and rebuilding countries after conflict. We've asked those questions, and we're clearly not done. We haven't asked as much, what does this mean for men? How do we engage men not only as allies in the cause of gender equality, but also saying, what do these things mean in the lives of men and boys? And that's this thing that we've decided to call, and many others call, a Man Box. And this is, it's often easier when we have conversations with individual men or with political leaders, it's often easier to talk about, we need men to nudge, to be part of the gender equality agenda, to do this for women. The more silent conversation, or if you want to see men look at their shoes in about a moment's notice, is to say, how's that manhood going for you? And then we'll start that movement of going, yeah, let me talk to my friend Brian over here. So this is what we want to do. We want to ask these difficult questions. Just about any man that we talk to, any man that I've come across or spoken to, we'll have some moment where we'll say, you know, oh yeah, that's what you mean by the Man Box. One of mine is, well, a few decades back, I was an undergrad in university. There was a rowdy party over the weekend, lots of alcohol involved. Girl had passed out from drinking so much, and stories going around of several guys having had sex with her after she had passed out. The first round, it goes around and there's kind of laughing about it, and then the guys who were involved basically said to the rest of the guys, yeah, they did this. And then there was those long silences. Was anybody going to acknowledge that is not consensual sex, and this is not okay? And there, you know, I don't know how long those went on. Was it hours? Was it a couple of days before some of us said, we have to speak up about this? That length of time, to me, was a very clear moment of the Man Box. Why was it so obviously right that we needed to speak out about it, but we took so long before we did it? And that took so long, any minutes that lasted before we started to talk about it was far too long. So this is what we want to talk about as the Man Box. Why is it that it keeps us from doing things that we know are the right thing, connecting to people the way that we should, taking care of ourselves, taking care of our own health and mental health? We are thrilled that about 2 years ago, we started conversations with Axe that had been doing Unilever, its parent company, had been doing some really interesting things of pushing definitions of beauty and women's place in the world as full equals in all ways with their Dove campaigns around alternative ways of thinking of women's beauty. And thrilled that as part of their of Axe, they were interested in rebranding, but also we'll hear from Rick about that, but also in engaging in a conversation about where is manhood today? What is it up to? How do we understand it so that they, as a partner, as a private sector partner thinking about where men are, could be part of that conversation. Thrilled, of course, that USIP was willing to have this conversation too. So let me set up a little bit the study. It's one thing to tell these individual stories, but we said, how much does this exist out there and what does it mean? We started off informed by some pretty somber data, which is about 1/3 of adult men in the US have said they've ever experienced depression. We often think that women's rates are much higher, but in fact, rates are about the same. The big difference is that women are far more likely at about twice the rate to seek help for depression than men are when they have depressive symptoms. We see that in the next issue, which is that men's suicide rates, suicide being the leading cause of death of young men in the US, men's suicide rates are about 4 times higher than women's in the US. Globally, we've got, from UN data, WHO data to be specific, 800,000 deaths a year from suicide. That is far bigger than the 500,000 deaths a year from homicide, and it's larger than the number of deaths every year from conflict. We don't talk much about the gendered face of that. 2/3 of those 800,000 deaths are men. Even when they're men, we know that women often pick up the pieces with families and lives and carry on. You see some data there about traffic accidents. The list could go on. If we talk about homicide, incarceration, and one of the issues we're also seeing is school performance. We've talked a lot about getting girls in school. Now we know that boys are more likely to repeat a primary grade than girls in 90 out of 113 countries. We know something is amiss with these ideas of masculinity. What are they? And that's where we started out with this question of the man box. What does it mean to be a young man today? How is a young man supposed to act? We did this in 3 countries, the US, the UK, and Mexico. And we wanted to look at how men are they aware of these norms out there of what it means to be a man? And the first overwhelming conclusion is that yes, young men, 2/3 and above, say, I have been told that a man has to act a certain way. In a sense, I can read there's a box there that somebody's trying to push me into. It is real. What we did is to gather the data, the next question becomes, so what does it mean that this box exists? We did surveys with men in 3 of the countries. These were both telephone and online, and focus group discussions in the 3 countries as well to hear in young men's own words. And we wanted to, as we asked about it, we also had to do a lot of inquiry about saying, so what is the man box? What is it comprised of? And these are the things. As we looked at the literature, other research that we had done in other parts of the world, listening to men, thinking about our own experiences, one piece of these, what we call the 7 pillars of the man box, one is self-sufficiency, the other is acting tough, one is physical attractiveness, one is rigid norms about men's roles compared to women, one is around heteronormativity, I think it's better to call this, and homophobia. One is heterosexuality, this idea that men can never say no to a sex act, and one is around aggression and control. These are what we think, and they hold up quite solidly across the countries that we've looked at as the 7 pillars of the man box. So I'm going to stop there. And Brian's going to share with you the results, and then we'll come back to the table. I'll trade places.
Okay, thank you so much for such a thoughtful introduction to the study, Gary, and it's a great honor to be able to be here with you all. I hadn't expected that we would get the prompt of what was your man box moment a little bit, but I shared one with Michael backstage even, and now I'm thinking of it as I kind of step up to the stage here again. It links in a couple different ways. That the moment I thought of was my sophomore year in high school when I decided to leave the locker room, as it were, in favor of the rehearsal room. And I didn't go out for basketball anymore and instead joined the high school musical. And I remember feeling at that point that, would my dad be kind of ashamed of me that I'd made this decision? And even to kind of question whether like a real man would want to pursue singing and dancing on a stage rather than athletics was kind of a formative moment for me, but I pursued that musical life, and it makes me a little bit more comfortable on a stage even now. And so that's my owning a little bit of breaking out of that box. But to get to the real message, I have just 6-7 minutes now to run us through what's presented in a 60-70 page report. So we'll have to go really quickly through all of these topics, but I'll give you some of the main messages and then look forward to discussing throughout the day. Oops. There we go. So first thing that we really wanted to do in this study was to determine, even to dig a little bit deeper about the extent to which young men are experiencing these social pressures about how to be a man. So not just, have you heard a message that you should be a real man, but item by item, broken out into those 7 themes that Gary presented. Do you feel that society tells you that this is how men should behave? So I've got just a selection of those 17 messages here, just 5 of them. Things like, a guy who doesn't fight back when others push him around is weak. A guy should always act strong, even if he feels scared or nervous. All the way down to, of course, men should figure out their personal problems on their own and not ask anybody for help. This is far too many numbers to expect you to read on a slide in a presentation, but you can see that more than half in every of all of these items are guys across all 3 sites said that, yeah, I get this message from society, I get this pressure. So we can conclude that that man box is really alive and well. Those social pressures are real. And we even had one participant in a conversation here in DC kind of capture this idea really well in his own words. He says, how does society let men act? Because of society, the pathologies and powers out there, men can only act a certain way. If you do not fit into the box, you are not labeled as a male, or one of the many labels we have talked about. So even he, in his own words, not knowing that the ultimate report would have this idea of a box, that was his own idea. But then we wanted to take that social pressure and see the extent to which men were also internalizing it, and they were themselves agreeing with those statements. And here's where things get really interesting, and we have to kind of live with multiple realities at once. At the one hand, you look across a similar selection of 5 items and see that the majority of guys, in most, though not all of these, are not agreeing. You've got up to 2/3, 3/4 in some cases, of young men are telling us, no, in my personal opinion, I don't agree with this thing. So to a certain extent, men are rejecting these social pressures. But I don't know that a lot of us would feel really proud or excited about the fact that upwards of 50 to 60% of men agree that they always need to act strong, even if they feel scared. Or that fully 2/5 of men in the top row believe that a man who needs to fight back if others push him around. So we kind of have 2 stories happening where the majority of guys are rejecting the messages, but still kind of too many are really clinging on to them. And from one to the other, it might be a different young man who agrees with one thing but disagrees with others. So then to really, for the methodology-focused folks in the room, to really understand what we mean throughout the report and throughout the findings by this idea of being in the box or out of the box, like Gary presented, we have these 17 messages that look similar to the ones that I just shared. And those 17 messages align themselves according to 7 different themes of masculinity. And each respondent was able to tell us that they really agree with this, they only slightly agree with this, all the way up to they very strongly disagree with this item. And we kind of code that with a numeric score. And when we add those scores up across all 17 items, then we can kind of come up with each individual person's score on that scale. And then anyone who had a score on that scale that was at or above the average for their country, so an at or above meaning a more inequitable views for their country, we coded those men as in the box. And then anyone whose score was below the country average, that's who we're calling outside the box for all of these analyses. And so I think that's helpful to remember, because when you see the phrase, the men most in the box and things like that throughout the report, you might think, okay, this is just a very small selection of men holding the most extreme views. No, we're talking about fully half of the participants in our study, and even men with kind of a mixture of attitudes. So we'll walk through the main, I think it's 6 themes of outcomes really, really quickly here. Each of these gets 5 pages in the report, but like 1 slide right now. But let's dive in. The first area we looked at was life satisfaction and self-confidence. And this one at first was a little surprising to us, that the men who are more in the box and holding more inequitable views also were pretty kind of satisfied with themselves. They told us that, I'm the man. They had higher ratings of their own life satisfaction than the other men. So we had to kind of grapple with this one and ultimately realize that there's a certain sort of comfort that really comes from aligning yourself and your identity to that socially prescribed definition of manhood. But understanding this in a fuller context, we start to see all of predictably, or the findings that would be more reinforced by other social science research that we're based on here, showing that being in the man box has many negative outcomes. So here we see that bravado is actually masking a lot of depressive symptoms and frequent thoughts of suicide. So Gary shared these grounding statistics from the US and from the world of how pressing the trends related to depression and suicide are for young men. And now we've started to see a little bit of the root of where that comes from. So being in the man box is associated with, it's actually at least 2 up to 4 times as high of a likelihood of saying that you thought about suicide within the last 2 weeks. Young men in the man box are also about twice as likely to show depressive symptoms. I had another thought on this one. Oh, we actually get to dive into this one. Good. So again, just to prepare you to read the report, you're going to see a lot of these green and red tables throughout the whole report. And what it's doing is for each of the 3 countries, breaking out those trends based on who's in the man box or outside the man box, using that figure that I described. And here, I guess you could, the main point to observe is, sure, the links with being in the man box, but also just how tremendously high all of these numbers are, regardless of whether you're inside or outside the man box. And when we add up these first 2 columns of depressive symptoms using an internationally standard kind of screening tool for depressive disorder, we found that about 40% of men across all sites would have met a screening standard for depression. And that's regardless of being inside or outside the man box. So we see tremendous levels of depressive symptoms, but a particularly strong relationship with subscribing to those restrictive notions of manhood. Okay, third area is friendship and support seeking. So we know that guys are feeling down. We know they have depressive symptoms. We know they're even thinking about suicide, but are they seeking help? Well, unfortunately, not very much. We were actually excited to learn that men were pretty willing to see themselves as support givers, that they helped a friend who was going through something difficult. But it's rare that men in our samples in these 3 sites would seek out help for their own experiences of mental health, and certainly not from anyone other than women in their lives. They would go to a romantic partner, they would go to their mother. Those were the first 2 figures that they reported seeking help from, but much less often their male friends, and very, very rarely their fathers. An interesting item that comes up here in the report too is that men inside the man box are about twice as likely to tell us that recently they refrained from doing something because they were afraid their friends would see them as girly or as gay. So we see a strong link in with the man box alignment and that restricting one's own behavior in a sort of homophobic way. Fourth area is risky behaviors, and here we see that the young men inside the man box are much more likely to engage in a set of risky behaviors, particularly binge drinking. But we also see that young men, and this again relates to a statistic Gary shared, are up to 2 to 3 times more likely to have been in a traffic accident recently. And here I think we get a little glimpse of the interplay of the man box and binge drinking. So that's in Mexico City, a young man says, that's when you end up drinking, going along with the group and drinking again and again to avoid being labeled as the one who doesn't drink. And you want your friends to think you're like them. So he didn't use the words man box, but it's clear he's trying to fit in with some kind of a socially prescribed set of behaviors. We also wanted to turn a lens on men's relationships with their own bodies, their own confidence, not just in terms of their life, but in their personal and physical attractiveness. And here we found persistent links in the young man's responses that attractiveness is really defined by muscle bulk, by your body shape, much more than the kind of individual, inward confidence that we saw in the video that opened the session being the defining measure of what makes someone attractive in the world. So, okay, I'm a quantitative researcher in front of a group. I have to at least show one bar chart. This is the only, oh no, we saw one earlier, but I get this one. So here, the gold bars are saying the men who agree that I'm satisfied or I'm very satisfied with the size of my muscles. This is the majority in all cases, but I can tell you by comparison with other of the reports of self-satisfaction, this was the lowest rate of satisfaction with any element of a body or any element of one's attractiveness that we found in the survey. And then the sort of dark gray bar there is showing that a substantial proportion of guys across all 3 sites, out of a long list of their body parts and various elements of their appearance, the vast majority selected 1 or 2 things, their weight or their body shape, as the top thing that they would want to change. And so this is just helping us understand how body image really sits in a male body as well. Okay, and then to wrap us up on the 6th theme that we looked at, and this also goes back to the framing and the motivation that Gary shared. We're not trying to look at men completely in isolation as if they don't have interactions with others around them in their lives. And we know through a lot of research that subscribing to more restrictive gender norms is linked with a young man's likelihood to perpetrate violence against women in his life, against his peers, against others, against himself, as we saw with suicide statistics. And so we can see definitively here again, in the US, UK, and Mexico, that the man box is a very violent place, and that those who agree more often with those restrictive notions of manhood are dramatically more likely to experience and to use different forms of violence. So to break these out just a little bit, we see that these young men in the man box are actually more likely to report that they've experienced violence, up to 1.5 times as likely to experience a verbal kind of bullying, and then with online and physical forms of bullying, up to as many as 3 or 4 times as likely to experience this as their peers outside the man box based on the country setting. So they find themselves in violent situations as well. But the numbers leap even more shockingly to the eye when we look at these young men's perpetration of bullying, up to as much as 6 or 7 times as likely to report that they perpetrate bullying in an online forum against a male peer, or that they've used physical violence. Just a tremendously strong link there in all of the 3 sites. And then also to show how, of course, attitudes and norms based on a kind of hypersexual identity or on an identity that sort of approaches women's bodies as somehow entitled to men, or this kind of a sexual attitude, we do see that men in the man box are 3 to 6 times as likely to tell us that within a recent time period they made an unwanted sexual comment to a woman. So we can start to understand this stew of a real restrictive masculinity as a root cause of many harmful elements of life, certainly many in the bodies and in the lives of young men, but also extending out to their romantic relationships, their family relationships, their peer relationships as well. And with that, I'll thank you for your kind attention and hand it back to Gary to conclude.
Thanks, Brian.
Sure.
So before we go into the panel, we want to just wrap up. So what do we make of all of this? The publication just came out in print an hour and a half ago. So we are still delving into this. We're very excited to be able to share it with you and to hear together with you. The first headline we take is that we might like to think that these versions of manhood feel something like from the last century, but they are very much alive and well. I should say we were pleased that on many measures, most of the young men across the 3 countries, and we see this in other countries where we've carried out the International Men and Gender Equality Survey, that the younger generation of men in many parts of the world is reasonably accepting of women as their equals. That part came through in pretty similar ways across the US, the UK, and Mexico. And the other part that came across quite similar is just how restrictive the man box is for men themselves in very similar ways across 3 different cultural settings. The other challenge that we have going on with it, and that Brian pointed out, is that there's both this sense of security by being in the box, particularly if you don't know where your future lies, if you don't know what employment looks like or where you're headed in this transition moment of your life as a young person. The man box gives a sense of security, of that affirmation of, yeah, I'm the man and I'm living up to what people think I should do. We continue to recognize and hold up guys for that. So it does give you this sense of false security, perhaps. At the same time, it masks all these things that I think, came out really strongly. And it also suggests just how confused and complex young men's relationships are. They feel like they can offer help, but they can't ask for help. And when they do ask for help, it's still largely a feminine thing. I can seek help from women. I can seek help first and foremost from mom, and second, perhaps from a female partner. Last on that list was fathers and male friends. So again, we have this notion that who helps us as men get over our own stuff is women. So again, we've got to think about what that means in terms of promoting a culture of care, and that care being something that men can do is not simply a feminine trait, but that the connection and the care of others is as much a masculine trait as a feminine trait. The other part is just how isolating the man box is. It gives us this sense that we're all these kind of islands on our own, and in our own silence that we can somehow even fix ourselves to get out of the man box. And we've got to step back from that and say, this is a societal thing. This is not about blaming individual men. Of course, we need to hold individual men accountable, but it's about saying, what do we all need to do as policymakers, teachers, families, parents who raise sons and daughters, to build on what we've done to make the world a bigger and more expansive place for the lives of girls. We need to think about how we free boys in a similar but not the same ways to be able to embrace our full humanity in terms of being able to be connected with others. So we end on a note of saying we don't offer this as replacing any of the work that we're doing to empower women and girls. This doesn't save that. This doesn't make gender equality kind of happen in 4 seconds by simply adding this discussion about the man box. But we do have a belief that without touching on these toxic ideas of masculinities, we don't achieve the full promise that gender equality offers us. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Wow. We have a great discussion in front of us, and I'm looking forward to just not only starting the discussion, but getting you all involved. And so first, though, I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. You have their bios, but on my left is Darius Kemp, Director of Mobilization, the Representation Project, what we just saw. Michael Reichert on his left, Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Boys and Girls' Lives at the University of Pennsylvania. Rick Struble from he's the Global Vice President of ACTS. Gary, you just met. And Yahir Zavaleta is the Executive Director of HIV Young Leaders Fund. And I encourage you to read all of their bios, but let's just jump right into this. Darius, we've seen some of this top-line research findings on the impact of the man box, and we just viewed this remarkable trailer, The Mask You Live In. Given your work, what do you see the role of media and messaging around all of these issues of the man box, and how do we challenge ideas about the man box?
So solve all the problems, basically.
Yeah, we'd like to solve it.
We're going to get there. You know, as many times as I've talked about this, being with the Representation Project, the answer is always changing and growing because I'm always learning, and we as an organization we're always learning and learning more about what people need, what messages work and don't work. But I'm gonna say the most important thing I think I learned from our youth summit. We host an annual youth summit. Our first one was last year. We're hosting again this year.
Where do you host it?
Well, last year and this year will be in San Francisco. The next few years it may not be. We'll see how that goes. We're very excited, August 5th. But I remember after our first summit, a bunch of the youth mentioned, even though I thought we had a very diverse group of people on the stage and engaging, there were still gaps in terms of representation on the stage. And the people who identified in that way noticed it immediately, which is what always happens. I notice when I'm the only black person in the room, which happens quite often, believe it or not, in professional settings and in academic and work settings. So when I don't see myself reflected on the stage, I instantly point that out. I notice that, I see that. And so media plays a really important role because media lets people see themselves in a place where they never thought they would be. If you'll indulge me for a second. When I was a kid, I still am in love with the show, but when I was a kid, 7, 8 years old, huge Doctor Who fan. I know. Who in Alabama in 1988, a black kid living in a poor black community, loves Doctor Who? I do. But and I still do love the show. But to this day, I am still rocked by the fact that I've never seen a black doctor. I've never seen myself in my favorite TV show that's been on for over 50 years. And that disturbs me. And when our youth and when people that we want to change, the men that Gary and talked about in the survey, we want to engage with those men. We want to give them a different way to view themselves. It's really important that Hollywood and New York and all these media capitals of the world take a stand and show that diversity.
Show the diversity and show that men can care, men can reach out. And how do we do it, Michael, in terms of socializing boys? You've been studying this for a while. What are you finding in terms of how we socialize both men and boys, girls and women, because this is a social construct. It doesn't happen in isolation.
Yes, I've been doing this a long time. I was reminded of that 6 months ago. My grandson arrived, and 31 years before that, my first son was born. And holding my grandson, who's 6 months old tomorrow, what I'm struck by is the openness of his gaze and the depth of his search. He's looking for me to reflect back to him something of reality. So I'm a developmental psychologist, and I have dug deep into understanding how we produce 18 to 30-year-old males that find themselves so quick to tuck ourselves into the box. Darius's movie, The Mask You Live In, begins.
To be fair, it's Jennifer's movie.
Jennifer's movie.
I only take credit for it. Jennifer Civil Nielsen.
The movie, The Mask You Live In, begins with a quote from George Orwell from a 1938 essay, Shooting the Elephant. And the quote is, "He wears a mask and he grows to fit it." And my work has been all about the growing to fit it part of that. And the thing that I would say that I agree with Kathleen is that we do that. There's certainly the boy's agency and range of choice, but in many, many contexts, that range of choice is really narrowed by the structures and the opportunities, the rewards and the pressures that we create as we invent boyhood. I've been thinking a lot about boyhood because of this grandson and his trust that I have it covered, that I know what I'm doing and that I'm doing what's best for him. And it's sobering and sad and feelings like that when I realize that I can't circle wagons around my grandson, and I can't ensure that he's not going to encounter the kinds of pressures and disrespect and danger that jams males into this developmental constraining, suppressing, soul-sucking context. I've got bad news and good news. The bad news is we're in a time where there's this discourse of crisis. You know, books like The Demise of Guys, The End of Men, The Trouble with Boys, Boys Falling Behind. These are the best-selling titles over the last 10 years or so. The good news, first, this is not new. We're newly recognizing that this is the case. My particular research has been in the area of education, and in fact, there's been a gender achievement gap since 1900 in the US. Boys arrive at kindergarten already behind girls in terms of many, many outcomes, what's called soft skills. So it's not new, and I think the other good news, is the structures of masculinity, the man box, the mask of masculinity, I think it's being stretched to a breaking point, and that we may be at a moment, not so much of crisis, but of creative disruption. I think we may be in a time when, as parents and grandparents, educators, we're actually being driven to acknowledge that this isn't working. And in our deep commitment to the males that we care for, our brothers and our friends and our sons and our grandsons, our students, we're being driven to acknowledge that this traditional mode that we're still rather wedded to, even the best-hearted people are still wedded to it, I think that we're being driven to acknowledge that it's not working. And we're in a moment, I think, when as we search for where to find answers, we're paying attention to boys, we're listening to them, and what they're teaching us is actually quite revealing. Research I did recently in 6 different countries led us to the stunning insight that boys are relational learners. That in fact, having a relationship with a teacher or a coach is a make or break feature for engaging males in learning. You know, knowing what we know, I think, is the biggest way forward. Actually acknowledging that we know that these males, these children are human beings, and they need what human beings need, things like relationship, opportunities to express our feelings, things like that. And I think that this moment in history when we're really at the edge of how far I think this traditional masculinity can stretch, I think it's a real opportunity.
Well, that's a perfect pivot into talking about how we actually look at selling masculinity. And we're so glad you're with us today, Rick, because you have a particular perspective as somebody who really understands the business world, the marketing. Unilever is a leading manufacturer of consumer goods such as Axe male grooming products. And yet, Axe has really been looking at this issue, funding research to understand what are these young men and what are their identities. And can you kind of give us a sense of the change that you've seen from your perspective? Because rarely in a Washington kind of policy world do we talk about the private sector and the business model and what roles you are also playing in trying to break out of the man box. So happy to have you on board.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. It's interesting to sit here to represent the private sector in the middle of very smart people. I'm the one who sells deodorants, basically, that's what I do. But apart from that, it's super interesting, the type of work that I can do, because I can look into what drives the needs and the wants of young men in general. And it's a super exciting moment as a marketeer if you look at how quickly society is changing right now. And it's changing in various different ways, and of course it's changing in the way that young men define masculinity and the man box, meaning that people outside of that target group, guys who are, or society, which includes older people, who are defining their world as a particular one. And what we are seeing is that being a man and defining what it means to be a man used to be very simple. You know, there were very clear rules that society was giving you, that you needed to look like that, you needed to do this, you needed to behave like that, and there was basically no way out. So that was simple in one way, quite sad on another, because I'm sure that man box has existed for a very long time without anybody recognizing it. However, what we see now is that masculinity and that view on masculinity in the young generation has moved on a lot, and we as marketers and Axe as a male grooming brand for young guys needs to adhere to that, needs to make sure that we are with those guys and talk to them on their own terms and be relevant in their lives. Now, if you look at the research and you see the issues that young guys are describing, they're saying, and they're saying it here in this research, it confirms some of the learnings that we had, which is their society is putting a lot of pressure on me, but I don't really want to talk about it because, you know, it's not a thing that I would do as a guy. But if you put them in a room alone, you say it's safe, you can talk to me, you know, I'm not going to say anything, so please, I did never mention that. That is something that is really interesting when they start opening up and they talk to us, and then they say, well, you know, if society tells me that I should act tough even if I'm sad, even if I'm nervous, I shouldn't show any emotions, I shouldn't do this and shouldn't show that. Now, if you look at that from a lens of a brand, and Axe is 33 years old, and it's a brand that, yes, provides, you know, body sprays, deodorants, body washes, stuff like that, so stuff which makes guys smell better and look better, hopefully. But even more interestingly, my job is essentially, I'm in the business of attraction. You know, it is about confidence and it is about attraction. So I'm trying to help young guys feel more confident. So what we are finding as a brand is that there's something in the way for those young guys to feel confident. So if my role is to stand by their side as a partner in their lives, and nowadays with the progression in digital, with social, a brand is almost like a friend for young guys. It is next to them, you know, it's part of their lives. You can converse with the brand, you know, you can ask Axe a question and Axe will respond to you. And therefore often young people trust brands more than they trust politicians, than they trust authorities. So therefore we have a big role to play here, and it is super relevant that we as an attraction brand help to tear down those barriers that have been put up there. So when we looked at that research, we understood that men are in trouble, and they are in much deeper trouble than what we were assuming. So we knew that they were struggling with the man box. We didn't know that they were so massively and so consistently struggling with mental health, with depression, with suicide to that extent. And therefore, that is the thing that we want to help change, and that's why we helped fund this, and why I'm so keen that I can sit here with you guys.
Are you going to show something here?
Yes, so there's different things that we are doing on the one hand. So we have the perfect partners as a brand, which is the NGOs that we work with. And we work with a representation project, we work with Promundo, and we work with another NGO called Ditch the Label. And they are one of the biggest charities who help tear down bullying and the effects of bullying. And you saw in the report, and what Brian was mentioning before, bullying is a big issue, and almost half of the guys out there experienced bullying in the last 4 weeks. Bullying of some kind, whether that's bullying, whether that's verbal bullying, physical, or really going, to detrimental means to really, really impact their lives. So bullying is a big issue, and Ditch the Label has a fantastic program to help those who are being bullied and those also the perpetrators themselves to get out of that vicious cycle. And I think it's a fantastic NGO that you should have a look at. So that is what we're doing to really change and to help change society and toxic masculinity. But we're also doing advertising, and obviously that is a big thing that we talk to people on a daily basis. We changed the way that we communicate to men, and we have a new theme, if you want to call it that, which is Find Your Magic. And Find Your Magic we launched last year with a tremendous success, and I just wanted to show one example of the campaign now.
Come on, a six-pack.
We'll be back to you. Thank you, thank you. So how do we begin to look at all of this work, Gary? You've been researching men in conflict settings. And we have this now tremendous baseline. We have 3 countries that are not in conflict, but you're showing us what kind of problems we have in terms of men and their feelings of being really stuck in a box. How can we extrapolate? What does that mean for a man who is living in a violent conflict? Can you guess at this, or do you have some more research for us?
Sure. Some in partnership with USIP and other organizations, we've been asking similar questions in a few conflict-affected countries, DRC, recently in Palestine and in Lebanon, in a project together with USIP and elsewhere. Not quite asking it the same way, and certainly you're an anthropologist, so I'll be careful about making generalizations. Obviously, each of these contexts has its own story to be told, and issues of ethnicity and social class and historical context come into bear. But there are some similar things around whether this emotionally restricted version of manhood allows men to be contributors to rebuilding peace and rebuilding households, or whether it turns them into or restricts them into expressing their emotions in the forms of violence. So whether we've done interviews and now direct work with men who are husbands of women rape survivors in the context of the Democratic Republic of Congo, whether those guys can find an outlet to talk about their own trauma from that event, is often a determining factor whether he ends up using violence against a spouse who's already a victim of violence, or whether he becomes a supportive partner who tries to break down the stigma that she faces in her community. We've recently interviewed, or our partner organization, Abad, has recently interviewed, and with collaboration with us, Syrian refugee men who are in Lebanon. Syrian refugees now making up about a quarter of Lebanon's population. So both Syrian refugee men and the population in Lebanon feeling this tremendous wave of the Syrian refugees coming into the country. And multiple stories there as well. Some men becoming closer to their children, opening up, finding a moment that in that displacement, not being the provider anymore, becoming quite involved in caregiving. Far more often was the story of men who close themselves off emotionally. They feel marginalized in the way that humanitarian aid is given. One of the guys in the interview said, or actually it was a woman who said this, she said men can't go to the humanitarian aid site to ask for aid because men can't do that. So the very moment that your life and your family's well-being depends on asking for aid, that is seen as a feminine trait. Some of the men talking about as well, he couldn't go out on his own alone because security forces pick up men if they're out on their own. Kind of a bit of profiling going on. He would go out, he would always make sure that he had to go out with a woman. So imagine this flipping around gender norms where we're used to women only feeling safe if they go out with men. A lot of men feeling their heads quite turned on this notion of I'm no longer the provider and I need her for my physical protection when I go out. A lot of men aren't faring very well with that. And in fact, most of the time, it was women who could tell about the pain that their husbands were experiencing, men themselves, very little ability to talk about that. We also did a household survey, Lebanese men, Syrian refugee men, about twice the rates of depression for the Syrian refugee men. Women had higher rates, men had, again, similar trends to the US, about half the rates of seeking help for it. I think the stories could go on. We've also interviewed Palestinian men who were in detention because of the ongoing occupation and conflict with Israel, and talking about how they wanted to gravitate toward a sense of manhood of I'm the one in control, kind of grappling with I want to be even more conservative as a form of resistance, but coming back and seeing that their spouses had taken care of, that their wives really could do everything while they were away. And again, spinning their heads about how they talk about gender issues, but they could talk about her, they did very little talking about themselves. So again, this emotionally restrictive form of masculinity in different cultural forms and different contextual forms, it's alive and well out there. And it doesn't, it's not that it resolves, the roots of the conflict in Syria or in Palestine or the other settings we're working in, but to have those who are involved in designing services in looking at what peace may look like in Syria someday, if we don't understand it, then we're often kind of exacerbating the very problems that we're trying to work on. So again, huge differences, but I think this enjoining men to we can talk about this. There are other ways of doing it. Finding your peace of mind to talk about it, as well as finding your, the magic in being able to connect up to others and to be your genuine self, holds up for us whether it's in a high school in Washington, D.C., or whether it's in a refugee setting in Syria.
Yeah, I find that actually stunning. The continuity of the predicament and the isolation of young men in whatever predicament, in a high school backyard or in a situation like you mentioned in Syria. We're going to come back to this, but I want to get Yahir involved. This part of the study was on Mexico, and so I'm interested in your reflections of the results, and also how you see these kind of rigid views of manhood affecting both men and women and the impact in Mexico. How do you see it playing out even in your own life?
Well, I have to start saying that this morning I was working, I was getting ready to start the day, and I received a text message from a friend in Mexico saying he was feeling sad, he was feeling anxious. He wrote to me, I have this pressure in my chest and I just feel like I need to cry. I was like, oh, well, try to let it go. Maybe you have to, it's okay if you cry a little, you will feel relief. And he replied me, and I can actually note the ironic tone in his text. I can say so. He was telling me, no, because men don't cry. I was like, you're kidding, right? No, I'm not kidding. I mean, like, you know, I'm surrounded of a lot of guys here. He works in an IT department in a business, private sector. So it was like, yeah, okay, I get it. So we left the conversation there. But it somehow reminds me, like, when I was a teenager and I was in the school, and there was a day when I broke up with my girlfriend at that time. So I was very sad, and I felt the same. I had the same feeling that I wanted to cry, but I didn't, and I couldn't because I was there and I was with my friends. And it's not the way that a young man should behave. Like, you shouldn't cry in front of other people. So at that time, I also had a lot of confrontations in terms like, I always consider myself like a very sensitive guy. And it was very difficult to me to reach out to girls because at some point it was like girls saying, okay, it's good that you're very sensitive, but on the other hand, it's like my friends saying, well, you know, you should be rude, you should be more like the conqueror, you should try to conquer the girl. And that was very challenging for me at that time. So eventually I stepped out of that problem because I accept my sexuality as a gay man. So no more dealing with reaching out to girls and sticking out of that box, but actually switching to another man box, which is what is said to be being a gay man in Mexico. And as you know, I'm a tiny, very shorty guy, and so I think that I fit also in that. I used to fit in that 50% of young men in Mexico that do not feel comfortable. I didn't feel comfortable in terms of my body and being a muscle guy, and with that also that man box in Mexico for young gay men that tells you that you need to be you don't need to be feminine, you have to be also the tough guy, which is like it's not very different to the one that I was living in the high school or in the secondary school. So it's actually very, very challenging in terms of what is said to be a man in Mexico or in many other countries in Latin America or many other countries in Africa, in Eastern Europe, anywhere. So I think the study is very interesting in terms like it supports questioning like what is said to be a real man. Like if we keep doing this kind of initiatives, or if we keep doing supporting or encouraging young men to try to question their privilege, but as men, but also what the challenges of being a man in their own context. I think we are having a lot of achievements in there because we are actually trying to make sure that people, or that the young men are actually trying to understand what are the contexts, what are they facing with. And in terms of the work that I do, in terms of sexual and reproductive health and HIV, it also plays a determinant role in terms of how key populations, for instance, men who have sex with men or transgender youth, actually are facing all those men boxes in terms of how they put them in more risk of HIV infections or STIs or many other challenge situations. So I think that there's a lot of things that we need to do. It's in this study, I think it's very interesting to see like how in Mexico, for example, we find that young men are more comfortable like having gay friends, or that they are more open or flexible to have these to play these activities or to perform this traditional roles that are attached to or assigned to women. But I mean, in terms of, we can say that we have achieved some field, but there's a lot of things that we need to do. It's not that gender equality is there. We are at some point, but we still need to have more initiatives and more questioning ourselves about our masculinities.
Yeah, I'm going to open it up to the panel now, because I know you don't all know one another, and you probably have questions of one another. So I'm just going to, I know you have something here.
Well, yeah, I was actually thinking about what Yahir was just talking about, because I come from a different cultural context. I'm from Alabama. I'm a Black American. My family's history in America goes back to slavery. And yet in America, I am always, the Black man in America is always deemed as being the things that are mentioned in the survey: hypersexual, hyper-aggressive, hyper-violent. That's kind of culturally where I fit in, and just on the outside of my race and my gender. But as a queer man also, it also is this weird thing that I'm always having these two identities that are always battling each other, and these two boxes, because the man box is a complicated thing, as we all know, but I think it's fascinating how I will be stuck in this man box, and then I will talk to friends or engage in like a queer space, or people find out that I'm queer, and it becomes a, oh, you're not like those other guys. You're different. You're not like them. And I think that's just something that, as we talk about it, I think something that is kind of touching on, I think, when we look across the world and trying to address this issue as Gary does, we need to kind of constantly remember that cultural context and cultural context is very important to breaking down the man box and making it something that people can break out of, because when I was in the Peace Corps and I was living in Jamaica, probably one of the most hyper-masculine cultures, I think, in the world, especially if you listen to reggae music, you can hear it all there in many cases. But while I was doing programming at the only male juvenile facility in the country, I asked the question, how do you view your masculinity versus, I don't know, say my masculinity, right? Like, I'm American man. They're like, oh, well, you're clearly a sensitive, kind of foo-foo, shishi. They say, a badman, a chichiman, right? That's what they would say in Jamaica, because they view American masculinity as very effeminate, while they view their masculinity as the pinnacle of masculinity. It's like everyone else is faking at being a man, while, and it was just really fascinating, the processes that these boys had of like, oh, well, you can be kind of like flimsy and feminine or whatever because you're American and all the guys are like that over there. But in Jamaica, no, like men don't do this and men don't do that. And it's just, that cultural context is just so important. I just wanted to point that out and highlight that.
The box is even tighter.
It gets even tighter in different places you go.
Others, comments on the man box, your own man box.
I guess I would like to say this. I think that we don't want to overstate the man box. Yes, it's consequential in all those ways that were sobering and shocking and frightening, but in being with boys, I was thinking about your story, Yahir, about your friend saying he wanted to cry and feeling constrained and unable to. I work at a high school a couple hours a week, and I run a class for 17 and 18-year-old young men. And basically, it's an emotional literacy class, and it's a chance for them to learn how to talk to each other, express their souls to each other, and listen to each other. So developing emotional skills, emotional intelligence skills. And I do a demonstration each time we meet in front of maybe 50, guys of all types. And, Division I athletes and drama people and, computer geeks and so forth. And I simply invite the guys that I'm doing a demonstration with to tell their story. Invariably, they go to the thing that they're really struggling with, and routinely now in this high school group, these boys will break down and cry. And what it confirms for me is that the humanity of the males in our society, it's intact. It's constrained by the boyhoods that we've built and that we're maintaining. and the set of choices that are available. But right behind that mask is a beating heart. And we get to free boys and help them, I think, have a broader range of choice. So it's great to describe these constraints and name it as a fact of the social structures that exist. But the encouraging thing is that there's a real vibrancy and resistance that's ready to be, I think, supported.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I love it. And there's a heartbeat in there.
Yep. Yep.
I can just confirm, Michael, what you're saying when we talk to young guys, and when we, for example, when we did the campaign and we started Find Your Magic, that video was seen by about 70 million people. And we were prepared for some backlash. You know, we show a guy voguing, there's a gay scene, there is a portrayal of men which is quite different from what some societies would say you should portray on TV. So we were prepared for, quite some vicious comments. 98% of the comments were positive. It was super positive to see how men and women, gay and straight, were really saying, yes, finally somebody is doing this. And when I sit in focus groups or whenever I experience young men together in a safe environment, all of a sudden the mask is taken off, and all of a sudden you see how much they're craving for this. Just show me how it can be. Take that box away. Just let me live that. And what I find very encouraging is the younger you go, the more we find that when we think of the mating game, as we call it, basically trying to connect with a potential partner, we see that has changed quite significantly. So what used to be about conquest is much more about connection. It's much more a relationship which is eye-to-eye level nowadays. And therefore, that's also when I look back at the communication that Axe was doing before, we lost some relevance with guys because we were not in tune with what they wanted. And we need to be a brand that needs to be a little bit ahead of them so they can aspire to being there and to be part of that world. And that's something that we understood, and which is something that I find actually encouraging. It's great to see that young generation having a very different perspective.
That's great. Gary, I know you're sitting over there pulling all these pieces together, and I was going to
comment on what Michael said around, I think it's easy, it's easy to hold up a study and the cover looks cool, and Brian and other colleagues who sweated a lot on it, it's easy to present it as a static picture, right? That somehow guys are this way. And I think it is important that we, understand on the qualitative part of the research which Yahir coordinated in Mexico, just shows how dynamic these things are. And I think, just to echo Michael's point, when we've created in programming opportunities for young men and adult men to think about these things, and even sometimes life circumstances doing it, the mask is a really fragile, brittle mask that breaks with, in some cases, quite just the tiniest of taps of giving men the safe space to be able to say, that humanity is close at hand and it can come out. Whether that's helping them see the harm that's caused to themselves and others by doing it, or simply by those around them changing and saying, we expect you to do X, and that expect may be to be the caregiver, to make room for a woman to be at the negotiating table and be the leader, and you might sit on the back row. What would that look like? But that we can, with some little nudges, we find we can get men to do this stuff, whether it's inviting them for a prenatal visit and saying, we want you to be part of this encounter with this new life that's on its way. Whether it's about a group education session that we and many other organizations, I see some colleagues from Men Can Stop Rape, we do this work in school, we see that it is possible that this mask can shatter quickly. And I think it's important as we hold up a study like this to say there's stories of men doing the counter, men doing caregiving, men standing up against the harm they see other men doing. Those stories speak even more loudly, I think, than the man box. And your affirmation that 98% of men saw this compared to your previous ads, right? I mean, Axe was doing a different version that some of us may have fantasized about, but it never really worked. I mean, just to say that. I may just add that, that it is, in fact, this is what men have been asking for. It's not that hard for us to in some cases, pull that in there. Now, what is the more difficult part is the power structures that keep wanting to make this. And Darius, you brought up the class issue, and I think what came out really strongly in the qualitative interviews here, young men of color, some gay young men of diverse settings in Mexico and in the UK, particularly some Asian immigrant men young men in the UK, talking about the issue of the powers around me that make me into the bad guy. Whether we call that racial profiling, whether we call that ethnic profiling, but the sense that the world boxes me in, that some of you have labeled us to be the guys who bring trouble, shapes as well daily choices. Yeah. And I think that's one that that takes a lot more thinking about.
Well, finally, I would like to share our experience. As Gary mentioned, I was supporting the focal groups in Mexico. So one of the most challenging things there, it was like inviting people to participate in the focal groups, because when I was personally inviting them to have this conversation of what is it to be a man, they were like, what? And do I have to question? So that's a real problem. That young men do not necessarily question themselves, like, or they living being a man, being a young man, they're not questioning their masculinity. But on the other hand, during the focal groups, when some of them open the first door to say, okay, well, my experience is this, or I have suffered this, and then the rest of the group it was like a sort of, I feel empathy with you, and I also experienced that situation. So it was very exciting to see how sometimes it's just like to pull a little bit that door to say okay, you can see that we all share common challenges and common problems in terms of what is it to sometimes to deal with that man box. And but yeah, once again, it's like it's when you talk about do you feel comfortable being a man? What are you facing being a man? It's just like, don't even have to question that. It's like that's the first reaction that we face in Mexico. In Mexico, we're inviting to this young man, but fortunately, there was a very good response, and I would say the people were very participative in terms of sharing their own personal experiences. So I think it's a matter, once again, as I was mentioning in my first intervention, it's a matter of encouraging young men and men in general to actually open a little bit to experience and to question themselves to what is it to be actually a man. And actually, as Mike mentioned, it's a matter also, I was thinking about it's a matter of aging. Sometimes it's more you are more allowed to express your feelings if you are a boy or a very young man. But if you're an adult, a man in the adulthood, it's just you are even more restricted to show your feelings. Sometimes, at least it happens in Mexico. So once again, I think there should be the way that we focus these efforts should be very interesting in how can we move forward with that.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that there are a lot of people, even one person already ready to ask a question. So why don't we pivot right now towards some of our colleagues here asking a question, and maybe we'll take a couple at a time. I see 1, 2, 3 right there in that corner. And if you could stand up, tell us who you are and where you might be coming from. That'll help us get to know you too.
There. My name is Marie O'Reilly. I'm from Inclusive Security. Thank you for this fantastic panel.
You might move it closer to, yeah.
This is very refreshing and badly needed. I'm curious, maybe in particular Gary, but anyone else who may have experience in this area, if you could say a little bit more about the links between the findings on the personal and interpersonal level, and how that might relate to how leaders, male leaders in particular, make decisions about whether to go to war, and not just individual leaders, but then also sort of state aggression and belligerence. As we know, men continue to dominate decisions about war and peace around the world. We also have a lot of research now around correlations between societies who treat their women better are much less likely to go to war. Is there similar research out there sort of on the man box at the macro level in terms of the behavior of states? Be very interested to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great. And we're going to go right to the next question, and then we'll wrap around again. Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Meg Lavery from State Counterterrorism Bureau, and this is the only time I'm happy to see a panel full of men. I wanted to get some more of your feedback on something that Yahir was saying regarding more mature adult men, sort of the focus of your talk has been on young men, and what is your hope for adult and mature men, and also what is the role of the father? We've talked a lot about peers, mentors, teachers, mothers, sisters, but what is the role of the father in the intergenerational relationship?
Great, thanks so much, Meg. And I think we can say safely this is a very positive manel, right? We call these manels.
Hi. Hey, everybody. First, thank you. My name is Bomani Johnson. I'm with a group called Emergent Pathways. And it was touched on throughout the panel. I didn't see it. Of course, haven't had a chance to read through the report. But intersectionality in terms of race and class in this sounds like I don't know if it's there or not. And I would like to offer a resource that was produced about a year ago. That was it's called Addressing Masculine Norms to Improve Life Outcomes for Young Black Men. It was co-produced by an organization called organizations True Child and Frontline Solutions, and I can shoot it to you, Gary, because I know I have your email.
That'd be great.
But I think it's dangerous at best, and definitely incomplete for us to talk about things related to gender without incorporating race and class in the analysis. Because what tends to happen is the dominant class or the dominant culture is the thing that is compared or discussed, or the frame from which we talk about how these things play out. I also appreciate the point that you raised about life in Jamaica and how it's not even masculinities, it's more manhood is discussed or seen and played out in Jamaica in comparison to even black manhood in the U.S. So I would say let's expand this story. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for bringing also the lens of intersectionality. It's definitely an important one, and we'll come back to it, and we'll get one more question in this round. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Kai Wiggins, and I'm currently searching for a job. So just last month, I graduated from a liberal arts college in New England, a college with a student body so liberal that it's actually received a lot of press in the national media for its recalcitrance to conservative ideologies. And among the student body, we try to be very conscious and aware of different power structures and systems of oppression with respect to race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, etc. Such that, in observing, I guess, the dynamics of heterosexual partnerships, I've seen that, like, espousing feminist ideals or, quote unquote, being seen as being woke has a certain kind of social and sexual capital in and of itself. And in a funny kind of way, you see men putting on a mask of feminism, whether they're doing it with full intent or not, as a way to outcompete other men in the competition for potential sexual partners. It's a way to be a better man and therefore have more sex. And in a funny kind of way, that totally undermines the objectives of feminism. And this is a concept that doesn't really receive a lot of press and a lot of conversation. You kind of get it, it's been talked about on sites like Jezebel or Everyday Feminism, and actually SNL has had 2 skits in their more recent episodes that kind of touch on these themes. What do we do with this idea that feminism can become a mask for men to live in so they can perpetuate toxic strains of masculinity? How do we address that when we're talking about the expression of signifying acts and things that are more traditionally coded as, I guess, whatever masculinity, like how do we talk about the more pernicious or underlying strains of toxic masculinity that we should address?
Great. Wow, what a round of questions. I'm glad I have all of you to help me. Well, this is really diving into the deep end, and I'm wanting to know who wants to take on Let's start with the leadership, Mary's question about male leadership, and what is this relationship between war and the macro side of this storyboard. Does anybody want to, did I get that pretty close? Okay.
I can't, I'll let Gary talk about war. I've never been in it personally, but I can talk about violence and abuse on a personal level. I was raised in a house that saw fights and arguments with my family weekly, monthly. It was so often I can't even tell you how often it was. And not just with my dad, but then later on with my stepdad. And I think my point that I think that I've been processing over the years, because there had been so much violence, guns, police called, abuse. Me and my mom, my sister, and I lived in a YWCA shelter for about almost a half a year, about a little over 3 months, because of all of the trouble and the turmoil. And I say that not for any sort of sympathetic thing or anything, but to point out that I think violence is this thing that can be perpetuated by men, but we are all victims of it. We are all causes of it. We are all people that encourage it and discourage it. We are all those things at the same time. Most people, I remember when growing up, most people would say like, oh, your family's having all this, why don't your mom just leave these guys? And why are they beating her? Why don't she just leave these guys? I ask those questions myself. It is not that simple. We live in a society, when we talk about masculinity, when you talk about violence, these things are never, are just linked. They're just linked together. And to the point where even women fall into these tropes and these pitfalls when it comes to violence and abuse and things of that nature. So I'm saying all this to say what we need to do as a society is have a conversation about violence and respect and how toxic masculinity is encroaching on everybody's freedoms and how it hurts men, definitely. It hurts women, definitely. You should please check out our film, The Mask You Live In. We talk about that a lot, but it's just something that I think men have a primary role in trying to address. But that primary role is 51%. The other 49% has to come from the other side of the aisle, because we all have to fix violence in our society.
Absolutely. Well, what about this mature adult role of the father? Meg asked about that. Any of you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Well, I have to say that in the report you can see that how the people in the survey actually reply that in the case of the UK and in the US, it was a very similar percentage, but it was a very low rate of young men actually supporting on their fathers to when they have certain problem or what they want to talk about, like individual problems or challenges they were facing. In case of Mexico, it was like 6%. It's a very low rate in terms of a very low percentage of actually young men that are willing to trust or to reach out to their fathers to ask for support. So I think we face a very clear challenge in terms of how can we encourage fathers in this case to actually promote or to build this kind of confidence circle with their kids or with their children. In my opinion, I think it's a matter that we should focus in the new generation. Sometimes, and I can see in my own experience, like talking with my father of being gay or of abortion or of many other things, he's more reluctant to kind of open his mind to that kind of discussions. And I can see with the fathers of my friends and so on. So I think the main challenge or the task that we should focus now is in younger generations to actually open that kind of conversations, to question their masculinities. Media, schools, friends play a determinant role, as we can see as well as in the report. But my conclusion will be that we should focus on actually for the future fathers to be more conscious and more out of the man box, so they can, when there's a time that they will become fathers, they will be able to have this confidence and to create a supportive environment for their children.
Gary, you want to take on this intersectionality issue of power and class and race, and I'm going to come.
Small topics like that. I think the first question of, what do these mean at the macro level, and what might big societal level changes look like on this, I think is a really good question. There's a couple of small countries close to the Arctic Circle that have been thinking about these things for a while. And I'm speaking of some researchers in Norway who have been looking at where men are doing almost 50% of the care work. They see a strong correlation with nationally representative declines in violence at the household level. There's some European data that suggests countries that are closer to something that looks like gender equality also have lower homicide rates. So clearly this stuff intersects. I think the bigger one that perhaps that is a tougher one to get at is the issue of privilege. I think getting men to let go of some things that are in our self-interest, to be more expressive, more socially connected, more connected to our children, and open in our relationships is kind of a self-interest piece. The world gets better if I open up to the fact that we have not achieved 50-50 equality around access to resources and income and who's in control is a bigger, tougher one. But I think we can't let this discussion about these things are good if men take them on get in the way of asking those questions about privilege. And just one question about the national data. The national data, what would this look like? We're talking with ACTS precisely about this. If we measured at a society-wide level how many men buy into the man box, could we correlate that with some things like suicide rates, like homicide rates and delinquency, like incarceration rates? We may not find a really simple correlation, but I think asking those questions is really a useful piece to try to move us ahead. The question about intersectionality and how do we make sure, I'm not sure if the colleague is still here, who asked the question of, we can't just look at manhood isolated from social class and race and ethnicity. Absolutely. We do talk about that in the report. We made a point of, in the sample, it does include men of different ethnicities in each of the countries, as well as it's representative by income grouping. We also want to be careful as we do the analysis not to, because a lot of our work on masculinities wants to say masculinities are problems with certain low income or certain ethnic groups. And we also want to make clear that we don't say the masculinities of men of color are a problem, of men in conflict settings are a problem, as opposed to maybe not looking up the street here and saying there might be some problematic masculinities in our midst. So I think it's also, we're being really clear as we talk about it that we don't want to say problem masculinities lie with men of color or with certain parts of the world. So I think that's another, we're spending a lot of time right now, and Brian's also writing this up and some other colleagues here, of some results from 4 Middle Eastern countries where we've applied some of these same questions. And we want to be really careful that we don't put out to the world that's already profiling Muslim men and Arab men as the world's problems and as walking, fill in the blank, terrorists or misogynist until proven otherwise, to say the stories go in all different directions. These are diverse. Everywhere we look, men are diverse on these issues. And I just wanted to make one comment on the final comment of, are men wearing this new kind of nicer guy masculinity to get laid? That is a good question. On the one hand, just to put this out there, more sex is not the problem. That's okay. We are okay with that. We agree with Axon. Consensual sex is fine. That's what we're after. We want women to be as free to have the partnerships they want as we want men to be free. What we don't want is to let that become, again, a tagline for not probing the questions about real equality. And I think it is easy to get into well, does this the flavor of the month that guys need to look like this? Or is this really provoking a deeper discussion about we're going to fundamentally question these inequalities? And so I think if we're getting the provocation going, we're on the right track. But I think your question is to say, let's not let the gain be that big. We really do have to keep pushing away at it. Some colleagues in Mexico and Latin America are talking about neo-machismo or machismo light. It's like he's looking a little bit nicer, we're looking a little bit softer so that relationships get along, but we're not really questioning the fundamental power inequalities. And so I think we want to provoke that to say, we're okay with you feeling good about this. Better relationships, including sex, is okay. We all, want those things. The issue is how do we make sure you don't stop at the power one. It's not a very good, easy conversation starter. So we can often start a conversation about this is good for you rather than, hey, you want to have a conversation about privilege. So it's also about how we enter the conversations. But I think your questions of not letting us off easy are really key.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of Rick. Yeah. How do you respond?
Well, to be honest, I don't, in what we do, we hear and see less of that. We see more genuine behavior, which is more equal than what it probably used to be, which is very encouraging overall. So that's what I can say. I think two thoughts on, one is to think of the issue at hand as a father of three. I have two little sons and a little daughter. So what I see when I read those reports, when I see those issues out there, is we need to look at gender as a duality, and we cannot ourselves try and act as if there's two separate issues, and there's the issue for my daughter, and I used to work on Dove for 5 years and campaign for her beauty, and I love it, and I think it's a great thing, and we should do much more of that. And then there is Axe and Find Your Magic, and there's everything that we're talking about now, and there's young boys. But we need to look at both and see how strongly they intersect. And I have had a lot of conversation with feminists, and some of them saying yes, 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 and some saying no, no, no. You're just trying to take our ground, and we have much bigger issues. And I think it's true that there are structural issues for women and girls which are undeniably very, very serious, and for my daughter's sake, I need those to be resolved. But at the same time, there are other societal issues about young men that we need, as fathers, I think we need to make sure we tackle. I remember, actually, I catch myself sometimes. I have my daughter Isabella. She puts my at that point 4-year-old Leo in a Frozen costume, and I'm like, oh, jeez, come on, the Frozen thing again, And my wife is like, let him wear the Frozen thing. I mean, why not? And of course. And then I catch myself, of course, why not? So I think we catch ourselves sometimes as human being just falling back. That's one thing. I think the other thing is, as a marketer, I think creativity has such a huge role to play here. This is a very sincere issue, and we always look at sincere issues with sincere answers. I think the moment that you can open it up to the wider society, just bring it on the table of the average family, is often through creativity and humor. Yeah. And bringing a very severe issue in a very lighthearted way, I think opens up that conversation a lot. So we're doing a project with a partner of ours, an NGO in the UK called Campaign Against Living Miserably, and it's called the Calm Photography Project. And we have asked photographers out there, all kinds of photographers, very famous ones, and just people out there, to send in a picture of what it looks like to be a modern man today. And some of them very sincere, some of them super funny, some of them just super weird, and I think that's great. I think if you look at that whole palette and you look at how creativity can give you access to that conversation, sometimes is a really great vehicle to make a little bit of an impact.
Yeah, wonderful way to think about it. Michael, I know you want to jump in here.
Well, I've just been thinking about your question about the liberal context and what it means for our discussion about a liberatory perspective And I think that I would interpret the question as, is it possible that we're going to find a softer, kinder morphing of oppressive and oppressing masculinity adapting to new contexts and opportunity structures? Absolutely. I think, and in my view, that would miss a revolutionary opportunity. We have a chance to really acknowledge males' humanity, boys' humanity, and get it right. But I think if we merely adapt to sort of the liberal gesture, the danger is we'll miss that opportunity and we'll just perpetuate this dynamic.
I know we have just a couple of questions here. I see one. Did you have one, two, three? Let's just get these three questions in and wrap it up, and we have a reception to follow, right? And so, please, if you'd introduce yourself. Okay. Both of you. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Keith Kozloff, is it on? Hi. One of the things that may be missing from the discussion so far, there is a men's movement out there. And as part of that, I want to put in a plug for an organization that I belong to. It's called the Mankind Project, which since 1985 has provided training for over 53,000 men, and then follow-on men support groups to break out of the man box, essentially, and to promote the values of authenticity and accountability and integrity and leadership. So just to say, if anyone wants some information about that, I have some brochures, so during the reception, approach me. And
Great.
then a quick question. The first video, and it's related, noted that the young men got support from their mothers, and that helped them break out of those stereotypical roles. And it was just curious to me that it was only the mothers identified and not other adult men. And I just wondered what the panelists think about the role of adult men. And I guess that's been touched on a little bit so far.
Great, thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jovan Bickerstaff. First panel, yay, mano, whatever we call it, I love it. As a gender scholar, there are a couple of things that I was hoping that you could speak about a bit more. So the first thing, are there some really kind of practical and tangible places of intervention, right? In the Ivy Towers, we talk a lot about the abstract a lot, and I'm really interested in where are some places where we can intervene to kind of not necessarily change masculinity, but to expand the narrative on what masculinity can be. You mentioned in youth, you mentioned at that point of fatherhood. Are there other spaces of good intervention? And then the second question, given the role that women often play in helping men articulate their emotionality, how do we think about the fact that a lot of the work that we do with gender tends to be sex or gender separate? And is there potential to possibly use some of that emotionality, vocabulary that little girls and then women are steeped in from a young age, and that men often receive engagement with their partners or with their parents, their mothers, to use some sex-open places, right, to begin to do some of that intervening work?
Great, thank you so much for bringing that into the conversation. And I know, you're right here. All right, thank you.
Yes, thank you too. My name is Kathy Cuellar. I work with the Pan American Health Organization. And so, of course, I'm delighted I saw statistics from the World Health Organization, and particularly the statistics on suicide among men. We had recently our first debate on gender masculinities and suicide, and it's an area of work we wish to promote. And that allows me to then comment on and ask, really, from the panel. panel on the following. I'm glad someone already underscored the issue of the diversity, the age, the ethnicity, the geography, class, etc., because we can't do any real analysis without that. So I'm glad that's already out of the way. But the data presented from the study highlighted from 3 countries consistently in the findings a difference with Mexico, except for, from what was presented, the issue on bringing home the money. So that, I guess, can stimulate a lot of discussion right there. But what I found interesting, additionally, is the fact that you did not explore much, or at least not in this very summarized presentation, I'm sure, the issue of what do men do with their leisure time. Time use in the home, at work, etc., which is a key component to understand the dynamics of the privileges of men, which brings me to the last comment. Conclusion number 2 of the study talks about, well, really, men still feel overall very secure in that box. We can call it the jacket, the box, whatever, but they're quite secure in the box still, to some degree, saying or making reference to the wider discussion so far on the status quo. And so how difficult it is to change that is really pointing us to say, okay, what other things we need to do? And I would venture to say we need to look at the man box with the humanity and inhumanity in the man box. And maybe that will allow us to find different ways to approach the man box and getting out of the man box. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughtful questions. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to respond to whatever question you want, but also your wrap-up comment. And so, Yahir, I'm going to start, and we're going to come this way. How about that?
Well, just to wrap up, I think that of course there's a lot of place where we can intervene. I mean, like I think that Gary can get deep into that, but I know that Promondo does this piece of work that actually promotes fatherhood, and in terms of men to get involved into actually caregiving with their children. So in many other places, what we can also intervene is the way that we can openly talk about like masculinity, sexuality, gender equality, and many other important topics related to make men engage and involve in that kind of conversations, to question once again themselves what is it to be a real man, and what is it to have or not privilege, and how to actually make gender equality a reality in all the contexts. And once again, it's also depends on different contexts. And I can say in Mexico, it's not the same to be a man in the rural area than to be a man in an indigenous area. So once again, we need to think about like different contexts and realities that young men in general are living.
Great point.
A couple of comments. One, the issue of, we heard in the film at the beginning, a mother and, a strong mother as being a role model for 2 quite articulate and thoughtful young men on this topic. We see a lot in our research with adult men, both using household survey data as well as listening to life stories, how much an involved father makes a difference, or an involved man of any kind doing hands-on caregiving. And I think, in fact, we've seen this hold up in interviews in Latin America. We've seen them hold up in the Middle Eastern data that we're just now analyzing, that where men and women report that their father or another man in the household was involved in traditionally feminine tasks of hands-on caregiving, women showed more equitable views, that is, more empowered views about their roles in the world, and their sons showed more equitable views about what it means to be men. So we do see that very powerful role, yes, and it also mattered if their mothers worked outside the home and if their mothers are educated. So there is, let's make sure we don't fall into any mothers are the exact answer, fathers are the exact answer. Empowered mothers, hands-on caregiving fathers seems to be a really key outcome for children to come out thinking, we are both as human beings, caregivers and providers. We have equal space in the world to be outside the home as well as to do as the care inside the home. And that, we can say that, but we have to be careful that we don't therefore say a house has to be a heterosexual couple, et cetera. We know that we have to say that in terms of breaking the binary of who does caregiving and who does the providing. And I think that we can say in pretty universal way that that equation does seem to hold up. When we can break that binary, we see children grow up with, Michael said this really eloquently, looking out whether we are boys or girls or intersex, looking out and saying this world is full of possibilities and I am not constrained because of whether I was born male or female. That part I think we can affirm. And maybe the colleague who was saying, you know, do we need spaces where guys talk about this alone, girls talk about this alone? We think it makes sense to have both. You know, we have to be careful that our solution doesn't create more of the problem. We worry about even using words like the man box or real man, because we're trying to help it implode as a concept. And so we do have to be careful. We want to call it out, but we also want to, make sure that we are focused on breaking the binary. So that's, maybe the piece that we'll take home. It's an issue, it's important, but let's make sure that our solutions really are about, opening up that full range of human expression, full range of us being men, that caregiving is human, it's not male or female, that being out in the world and being a leader is not a masculine thing, it's a human thing. Women should be open to that every bit as much. So that's the equation that we're trying to bust open. And I think, thank you for, those of you who asked questions that tried to provoke us on that. These are really key ones. And I'll just as a final word, ACTS took a risk stepping out in this, and I think it's exciting to see them do that. We often critique the parts of the media who don't move in the right direction, and it's an exciting moment to be with a company that does shape how men look at their lives, and it's saying we're going to take a risk out here and get men to step out. I just wanted to add that word. And to USIP, I know Kathleen, the space here is limited in terms of how many sessions there can be. This is Women's History Month. Lots of things were not done on the challenges that women and girls face. And so thank you as well for offering a space to say masculinities are part of that equation, and to sitting on this mantle with us so it's not so manny. Thanks.
Not at all. Thank you. Rick?
Well, thanks Gary, for mentioning also the fact that this was taking a risk as a brand. It always sounds very simple at the end when you look at it and everything went well. But if you look at even the barriers that you have to turn down inside an organization to try and do something, change something which has been working so well for such a long time, so why would you change it? It's very similar to, if you look at society, that people do not recognize that there is an issue, with the man box, and everything is going well, but why would we go ahead and change anything? I think that's the attitude that we need to try and break as individuals and as professionals. So I think as a father or as an individual, where I see there's a lot of intervention to be done is passion points of young people. Take sports, for example. I think getting intervention into where boys are together and they are crafted to be those young people, those young men, and I think those are intervention points to the question earlier, where we really need to be, whether it's music, whether it is sports or the passion points that young men have. Just lastly, I think there is a massive role for the private sector, and often there is a bit of hesitance. There's a hesitance whether it's from NGOs. I've worked with UNICEF in the past. I've worked with them very closely on issue on sanitation around the world. And the first year was horrible. It was so difficult because, and I understand, you look at that, there's the evil private sector and all they want is basically our name, and they just want to sell more products. And it took a long time to work together to get mutual understanding that actually we have exactly the same objectives, and that we can provide a voice to somebody like UNICEF that them alone they cannot, and we can give a voice to a issue like this, which is being on terms with young men in their language, in the places where they go, and actually help them understand that there's an alternative to being in the box. And so therefore it's my plea to everybody out here to reach out to private sector partners, to try and work together and help on this issue.
Great, thank you so much. And we're, as I said, happy to have your involvement and would like more private sector involvement on these issues around violence, around conflict, and around peace. Michael.
Yeah, it's hard to be succinct at this point. I'm thinking about the question about strategies. And I would just have this to say, I think, that what's remarkable about traditional models of boyhood is how ubiquitous they are across all the differences of class, race, country, things like that, how generally it's the case, Gary's numbers, Promundo's numbers, about 90 out of 100 in some countries reported similar findings with respect to the man box. So it's ubiquitous and persistent. It has, traditional masculinity has produced bad outcomes for a very long time in education, violence, mental health, and health, and yet it persists. I think the answer to that is that boyhood wasn't devised, wasn't designed with boys in mind. There's a core contradiction about boyhood. It's not for boys. It's for a broader purpose. And the contradiction is that boys never fit that box very well. There's an inherent revolutionary spirit to be tapped if we can, in fact, open that up and tap it. And almost any of us can tell stories about simply talking to a boy and inviting him to be himself, lifting the mask off his face. And I think if we can find ways to do that broadly as a culture and society, I think we may tap into something that can fundamentally change a lot of outcomes, including violence.
I think we have to take Rick's challenge of being more creative in that exact approach. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Well, Darius, you began and now you're going to end our.
I think being more creative is a really key point, and on that idea of like interventions and how do you kind of get to the core of it. I think there are a lot of great people and groups out there doing the work. I can say on our end at the Representation Project that we just started a new project, which is really awesome, where we go and do trainings with athletes, male and female, at colleges and universities, high schools, which is really awesome. But in my experience at doing that, to also the point of like having single-sexed or single-gendered room versus multi-gendered or gendered rooms, you have to have both of those. Gary is right. You have to have both of those because when we've done the athletes training with men and women's teams all in the same room, the male athletes immediately start posturing and they're like, oh, nothing's a problem. Everything is great. Everything is good. But the women will actually try to emote and get their feelings out there and actually say the things that they want to say in a room with guys about how they feel about sexism and catcalling and all these other things. But then subsequently, in my experiences of doing this work, when we isolate the men and the boys, that's when we can have like a real conversation. And they're able to open up more. So I think we all need to understand and realize that like for men in this world, calling them out in a room full of women or in a room full of other men will never get you the response you want. You just catcalled me, you just did this, or you just did that. We're never gonna get the change we actually wanna see. But I've found that when we have these conversations one-on-one or in small groups of like-minded people or people that are supportive, it is always better. So I really want to push that. And I also want to say, ask the question. Do not be afraid to ask a man how you're feeling today. How are you doing? Go deeper than, oh, fine, great, moving on. I've asked that question, box checked. Because I think the point that Gary and Yahir and others have talked about around depression and mental health is like really important. Those are things that I struggle with, and there are many days, even though I do this work, I have a graduate degree in this work to a extent. There are many days where I sit and say like, nobody wants to hear a grown man cry. Nobody wants to hear a grown man whine. So I won't talk to my friends about something. I won't call my family about something. And so we just need to realize that we should just ask the question and don't be afraid to know that you may say something wrong. You may use the wrong gender pronouns. You may use the wrong whatever word. But just be honest and sincere and ask the question and have an earnest conversation with someone.
Well, and I think that's what we've had today, an earnest conversation about the man box, a box that I think we all recognize in our different ways. And as a woman, I want to have the last word and say that I think this kind of research helps all of us, and we're absolutely convinced in the work we do on dealing with violent conflict that as countries, as societies come out of violence, it takes a whole of society to rewrite the rules. We need men and women together engaged in a gender relational approach. And we get there by having men understand the impact of violence and conflict on their lives. It takes us a step further toward understanding how many opportunities and how many roles we really all can play in our societies. So I want to thank this amazing panel. I hope you'll join me. And thank you for how far you've come across the sea, across many states and worlds. And thank you all for a very engaged conversation today. Please join us outside these doors right here for a lovely reception. Thank you, ACTS, for sponsoring it, and we are grateful again for all of you being with us. Thank you.